All right, I'm Hunter Braithwaite from Cultural Council. Thank you for coming. This is Art Criticism, Why? Before we get started and before we hope to ultimately answer that question, I want to thank a couple people. I want to thank Emily from NADA. I want to thank Adam from Cultural Council. And I want to thank Julia, who is moderating the next panel, which starts right here in 2 hours. So come back at 3 o'clock. And the panelists, who we will introduce in a moment. So, to start us off. It's tempting, because of the weather, because of the traffic, to take a dim view. Art criticism is either on its deathbed, or it's locked in a tailspin. It doesn't know what to do with itself. It doesn't know why. And sure, publications are consolidating, shuttering, the attention economy is bankrupt, and while art criticism maintains a central place within the world of art writing and journalism, a quick peek at website analytics shows that reviews perform poorly in comparison with basically everything else. So, moribund, maybe. Crisis, always. But it's also a time of great potential, a time of unprecedented insight and bickering, complementing a core group of legacy publications like Artforum, ArtNet, Art News, Art in America. We have a variety of independent and self-published platforms happy to disregard the status quo. We have an audience larger than at any point in history. We have more things than ever before to look at, some of them even are art. And we have people like you who braved both rain and surge charging to get here today. So thank you for coming. And we have brilliant voices like the panelists here. So we've gathered 3 writers to discuss art criticism in its many forms. Joining us are Ben Davis. Ben is the author of 9.5 theses on art in class and art in the afterculture, and national art critic for ArtNet News. He's currently working on a book about the definition of art and the meaning of life. Next to Ben is Reilly Davidson. Reilly is a New York-based curator, writer, and the current director at Martos Gallery and Shoot the Lobster. She's worked at Artforum and has contributed catalog texts to numerous galleries. She's currently organizing a show at Modern Animals in Zurich, opening this fall. And then next to Reilly, we have Dean Kissick. Dean's a writer and lives in New York. He's currently writing a book about the last 10 years of art and self-expression. He also hosts the Seaport Talks, a monthly series of conversation with critics at the bar T.G. Burns in Manhattan, and is a contributing editor of Spike Art magazine. From 2017 to 2022, he wrote the monthly column, The Downward Spiral. So, over the next few minutes, and with the help of you all, we will hopefully answer the question, art criticism, why? But to start, a quick bit of double appropriation. At a panel a few weeks back, a director of a New York institution said that museums are empathy machines. I really liked that, so I looked it up. Turns out that phrase was actually coined by Roger Ebert, who was talking about the movies. But I want to take it from both of them and ask, if art criticism is a machine, what does it create? Critique, context, community, continuity. I'm sure there are a lot of other words that don't begin with C's, so let's start there. Anybody want to jump in?
What is art criticism? Is that the question?
What's it create? What comes out of the conveyor belt?
Well, I don't think that there's actually a single answer to that. I think it's probably a fool's errand to try, and because you know, if you think of art criticism as an expression of like what people want to hear about art, you know, the universe of ideas and writing that circulates around art. I mean, there are probably as many kinds of art criticism as there are kinds of people. So I can't really speak in general. I will say that that I think our sense that there is something like art is pretty coextensive with the existence of art criticism. That if you don't have people who write about it and give readers a sense that there is an object that is taken seriously by writers, by people producing ideas around it, then I don't think you have something that is experienced as art. And I kind of think that some of, you know, I keep hearing people say like how, you know, this is a tremendously bad time for art writing or a bad time for art, and I do agree, but people have been saying that for as long as I've been writing. People have been saying that for several generations before I've been writing. So the interesting thing to me is to kind of specify what the nature of that badness or what the, you know, why things are the way they are, why they feel the way they are. And I would hope that art criticism produces something like that, like a sense of contemporaneity, like what it means to be making art in this particular moment.
That seems like a good place to jump off and pivot to you all. What does it mean to be making art? What does it mean to be making art criticism in this contemporary moment? And going back to the conveyor belt, what comes out of art criticism?
Also, I'd love to know if you guys like the empathy machine definition. I'm not crazy about it.
No, I thought it sounded stupid, but what does it mean? What do they mean by a museum as an empathy machine?
That I think it would create the conditions and the context to help people understand and relate to each other and perhaps maybe themselves better. A very humanistic rubric for the museum, but just something I heard a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I kind of disagree.
Yeah, that's not what a museum is for, but it's, I guess, it's that there is like the idea that you could, from like looking at an exhibition or reading a book, get like gain like a empathetic bond with the creator is like an interesting one. I think it's a good one because that is one of the things that art or novels could do, is kind of give us a unique insight into another person's perspective, their life, not just their life though, their kind of mind, in a way that you can't really do with anything else. Yeah. And actually, like, I think that's something that's been lost a bit recently. That willingness to like really just throw yourself into like another person's position without judgment or without like needing to compare it to your own position, your own circumstances. But yeah, I mean, there's when you say empathy machine, to me that makes me think that like the idea there is that the role of the museum is to build a better society, right? Like it's actually like the museum is not focused around art or like the audience's experience of art. It's more about building empathy between us all as people, making the world a better place. Whereas I don't think that is what museums are for, and I don't think art is a good way of doing that.
Well, I didn't say that I agreed with them either. So we emerge from this thicket on the same side.
I don't love the idea of
which museum? Which museum?
Oh, it's down the street.
I don't love the idea of an empathy machine, incidentally. I don't love the idea of being strapped into a machine. This sounds like the end of Clockwork Orange to me.
I do think that some institutions definitely purport to be sort of in deference to like a community building or something, but I don't believe that that's necessarily par for the course or even realistic as like a place that displays art. And it's like a lot of individuals kind of coming into a hub, but not necessarily connecting with one another.
Sure. So
if that's the director of the Whitney, if you say like it's a museum down the street, I don't know who said this, but they have the Josh Klein show up at the moment, which I haven't seen yet. But actually, my friend was talking about it at dinner yesterday, and he said he thinks it might be like the worst exhibition he's ever seen in his entire life. Like he said, like this is as bad as art can be.
Wait, yesterday somebody told me that was the best museum exhibition they've ever seen.
Yeah, it's interesting, yeah. Well, it's well reviewed, I think. Yeah. I don't know, I haven't read any reviews. It's on the cover of Art Forum. and actually that's like, that's a good thing, right? Like the kind of, the problem I have with art, not to get into it too much, but like my biggest problem with art is that most of what I see just is not capable of provoking that reaction, like that depth of admiration or that depth of contempt. Like, most of it is just very middle.
He's mid, yeah. He's mid.
Yeah.
Isn't it always though? I mean, isn't that by definition the majority of stuff is always going to be middle of the road? I mean, it's the middle.
No, I don't think that's like a kind of. That may be true in practice, but I don't think that's like a logical. Just because there's a lot of stuff, it doesn't follow that most of it's gonna be mid, right? You could just have like a lot of bad stuff and a lot of good stuff, or.
I think the worst case scenario for anybody staging an exhibition is being like, oh yeah, that was fine, that was good, passable. Yeah. I'd rather somebody say, I hate that, and then talk about why. And that's, I think, too, bringing it back to criticism, creating an argument that people can sort of react against. It's like teeing up a position upon which you can agree or disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to bring it back to criticism too, I mean, I guess I just think there's a quote from Renata Adler that I really like, where she talks about how the problem with most criticism is that most art is mediocre, but you have to produce criticism on the problem with the deadline critic is they're producing on a schedule, and that means like it's very boring to say things are boring every week. So you have to either like underestimate or overestimate things just in order to keep the machine going, which is that's sort of the definition of hack writing. But navigating that, I think, is kind of one of the big problems of the profession of the art critic, not art criticism as writing, as just a vocation.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, the sort of hack writing existing between the Hatchet Job and the Rave Review. Josh Klein being both the best show that anyone's ever seen and the worst show simultaneously. How do you all navigate that as working critics?
Well, I just don't write very much, And
strategy.
I had a monthly column, and that forced me to write every month. But that was good because it forces you to write when you don't want to. But I still wouldn't write about art that much. But sometimes I try to just go see like loads of shows in Manhattan and kind of create a context where there's some reason to be passing judgment on things that you don't have a strong judgment on. But I think it's, you kind of need to be pushed to do it, right? Like there's not really a motivation to just, like you say, to just keep writing about stuff that you don't have a strong feeling about. And also, just feel like an asshole, unless there's a reason to be doing it. Like unless someone's saying to me, go write about all these shows that you're not gonna like, I think why would I go write about all these shows that I don't like, that just clearly aren't really aimed at me? Like, what's the point? And I can have an audience who also those shows aren't really aimed at either, who will maybe enjoy it, but yeah, it's also a question of like, if there is, what is there something to say or not? Like, is there something worth saying?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like on purpose I've sort of avoided writing criticism just because I'll have an experience with a show and then a couple weeks later I'll think back to it and be like, oh my God, I actually loved the thing I thought I hated, and to have some like sort of ink and paper and create a definitive stance about how I feel about, a body of work. That just doesn't feel, I don't feel aligned with that, and I don't feel excited to write that way. But I think, negative criticism is, I think, a lot more valuable than positive criticism because, again, it produces an argument, and I think negative criticism elicits a lot of frustration, from the people that are staging the show, from people that love the show, just as positive criticism can sort of do the same on the opposite end. But yeah, I guess that's kind of...
Me? Yeah. Well, the dead honest truth is that there's just less and less hunger in for that kind of writing, for the kind of like negative or positive review. The kind of writing that's main purpose is just is this good or bad? The Consumer Reports kind of stuff. On the part of editors in my world, there's just less hunger on it. So the problem doesn't really actually, like if I want to do that kind of writing, it's because I forced myself to do it. I mean, people would always rather me be writing something, a hot take about something else. That's just for sure. I mean, I agree with I think more or less with Dean that, I mean, over time I've come to think that that kind of thumbs up, thumbs down criticism is more an excuse to write than the point of writing. I don't actually think at this point in art critical history, like, I think people see the images online and make up their own mind, or they read the press release and make up their own mind. If you want to be part of the conversation in a sustainable way, I think you need to be producing ideas, you know, something more, or that the opinion, positive or negative or mid for that matter, has to emerge from something you're adding to the conversation.
Yeah, like having a strong stance, or like, you know, well, properly biased, I suppose, like, but kind of staunch in that bias as well. And I feel like that's kind of where a lot of people have failed in criticism, is because you can see certain tendencies or favoring, you know, certain groups of people, or not favoring others, and I think it's easy to be labeled as, you know, a sort of, you know, misogynist or XYZ, especially like as a man writing criticism, or and I think that is, people are less willing to be crucified for opinions in that way, and I think that's part of the problem as well.
So how much of this malaise around, you know, criticism, I know, right? I got about 15 minutes into the conversation before saying it, is due to the format of the critic's pick review, the 300, the 600, the 750 word review, which, you know, everyone professes to really want, but, you know, in conversations that I've had with editors, those are usually the worst performing bits of content on the website. I mean, people just aren't really reading them. However, people are reading your column, your book, your essays. So it seems like the appetite is there, but maybe there's just chafage against a form which needs to be broken out of.
Sure. Yeah, that form is completely redundant. Like, there's no need for it.
I mean, so I do. If I do it, it's because I want to. I've realized I do want to. Is the thing. I do think there is a certain kind of value. See, what disturbs me a little bit, I mean, that's absolutely true what you said, is just the numerical evaluate. It is true.
It's disturbing.
It is true that yes, people will read more if it's some kind of huge synthetic piece about, you know, they'll read the Downward Spiral more than they'll read like a little gallery review, because it like gives them a sense of what's going on in the bigger sense, like in its social dimensions. But I don't know that means it's not socially valuable. Like, I mean, and having written a book, I know that, like, you know, you do want someone to review it. You know, when you produce something, you want someone to tell other people that it's good. And I think the value of that kind of writing, not necessarily as a literary form, but just as its social value, is that it gives writers the excuse to be going around and building up a series of thoughts that can become synthesized into a higher thing. And it's because it doesn't traffic. It doesn't traffic because it, by definition, about stuff, for the most part, about stuff that's like not famous yet. And so the back of the book stuff, in theory, in its best form, plays the service of it's the first step that something can get like lifted up into attention. I think the fact that so much attention is generated by the other bullshit tends to make that feel smaller. But in the bigger, if you step back and look at the bigger picture, I think that's kind of like, you know, eating up the kind of nutrients in the soil, like monocropping, because you end up like you just aren't sustaining the molecular relationships of art writing and art thinking that can become bigger stuff. I mean, I think you're really lucky to have had a column. I mean, it's amazing what the Downward Spiral became, that you were able to like go around and spend a whole month kind of synthesizing stuff. But for most people, I think that work would have been done through reviews historically, like as their excuse to like leave the house.
Yeah. I'm someone who doesn't like to leave the house that much, you know.
Well, what about this?
Not until nightfall.
What about the people on the other side of the screen or the page? Like, who is the audience these days?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And also just coming back to, but I'd also ask just what is the 600-word review for? Like what do you, both of you, like, see it as for? If you write them, like what is even, because I don't even know if that's clear to me. Like, what is the purpose of that? What am I supposed to do? I'll like describe the show a bit and try to come up with some.
I agree. When I used to edit, I would tell the reviewers, if this feels like the point of this review was that we had to fill space for this week, then you have failed. Yeah. Like start from asking that question of like, really, like, what is the point of this? But it's actually, I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of reviews now kind of take shape as glorified press releases and sort of just painting sort of like a quasi stance on a thing, but that could have just as easily been a press release for the show. And the real criticism, I think, is happening, you know, in blogs and in person between people. And I do feel like because things are a lot more visible with the internet, et cetera, people are less willing to share opinions because it circulates a lot, and then the fear of backlash, cancellation, and, you know, the like.
I think that they're quite useful in creating the historical ledger, in giving writers a chance to develop ideas, and providing the materials for writers and curators and other people to return to those ideas. I know, Ben, when we were talking, you mentioned using reviews to synthesize larger arguments, and that their existence is necessary so that writers can go back and like review the notes that they've made, but that have been edited and put under the pressure test of someone else's track changes.
Yeah, I mean, but then we're kind of saying that the reviews are just for the writers, right? Saying that's just somewhere where we can like work out ideas that we can then build into bigger pieces of text.
Yeah.
I do feel like, I mean, historically it's been the case that I think Sheldal talks about deciding what to write about based on quality and significance, and I think the decision to write about the thing kind of, you know, can support it being considered significant because it's been put into print, and that's, you know, just one kind of bouncing point.
I mean, I would say that a lot of writing is just for writers, at least, you know, until it goes out in the world. But to return to the question earlier I'd said about the reader, I mean, I think a lot of this conversation could benefit from considering the reader, who they are, how they're interacting with the work, and, you know, what happens next. Reilly, when we were talking, you mentioned two important readers for you. Tell me, who are you writing a piece for to begin with?
Yes, I mean, a lot of my writing extends out of just writing for the gallery and the artist. So I'll write exhibition texts, and my editor is my mom, because I feel like if she understands what I'm saying, it feels successful to me. I don't want to, you know, overwhelm the reader with too much like jargon or etc. So she's certainly one of the people that I'm writing to, and also the artist, because the artist is largely communicating something visually that you can sort of ascribe language to, and to be able to do that with like a certain voice, a certain, you know, poetics is exciting. And so if I feel like I've really communicated something that the artist is trying to get across in their work, that feels like a success to me.
And there's a really famous and very old, I don't even know if he's still alive, New York staff writer who would start every piece, you know, addressing his mother, and the first sentence or two is like, "Dear Mom, this is what I'm writing about, this is what I'm going to do, blah, 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 blah." And then write the piece, because it set up a sort of like genuine, intimate human connection with the person on the other side of the page, and then just cut it off with scissors. So it's a good strategy.
That's a great story.
Yeah. But yeah, let's, so envisioning the writer, envisioning the reader, and also you mentioned earlier literary forms. Dean, your work, you know, that column, I think, with the sort of pronounced first person that I don't want to use the flaneur word, but you know, moving through the city, seeing art, seeing a lot of other things, and then having this sort of like hybrid appreciation for both. It taps on a lot of literary traditions outside of criticism. So I was wondering if we could talk about that, if there's any way to expand our notion of what criticism is in order to invigorate it with new voices, new forms, new models.
Yeah, I think it's. I think we criticism should be very open to like all forms, you know, different styles of writing and experimentation, and so on. And I feel like it probably is. Like I feel like you can write in a wide variety of registers now. Also, like so many people self-publish now. Perhaps less so in the art world, because that's still like, it's not a huge audience. But I think you're free to write however you want, and we should be encouraging more kind of different styles, different approaches. That would be a good way to reinvigorate criticism. Also, like a brief tangent, I don't know that actually art writing or critical writing is doing badly now. Like my feeling is that actually critics like play like quite a large part in the conversation, and critics have writers have quite a high profile in a way that I don't think would have been the case before, because you know, we live in a world that is all discourse now.
Yeah.
Like discourse makes up a huge part of culture today. Like writing and opinions and arguing is a huge part of culture today. So I actually think like writing is flourishing. It's a good time to be a critic, a writer. So it's more that like the traditional form of the review, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
Press releases, for the most part, don't make sense to me, although they're probably gaining in importance rather than losing importance. But I think there's certain, I just think there's forms of writing that became very moribund. They became stagnant, like reviews is an example of this, or press releases is an example of this. But one experience I have, like we're a few generations into like art writing now. So I'll sometimes get like emailed by like young aspiring art writers. I don't really read those emails that much anymore, but I used to. And you'd get kind of students who are like just clearly, they just send me nonsense essentially, but like clearly they are reading this gallery text that doesn't, they're just reading this style of writing that doesn't really make sense, and trying to like teach themselves, because they're like, this is what art writing is. So you have someone just like doing a kind of simulacrum of something that doesn't make that much sense anyway, and you just get this like...
Simulacrum's a good word. It seems very French. It reminds me of the whole argument around International Art English, which is a decade in the past now, but looking back to the days of October and people translating work from English to French to back to French to back to English, and then they get what we know of and what I think we've been moving away from as art writing, capital A, capital W.
See, I hate the International Art English argument, actually. I don't think it's a good. I thought it was always an alibi for anti-intellectualism as the internet kind of disintegrated discourse in the early 2000s. It happened. The essay was in 2012. That was like pretty much the moment the discourse shifted. I think the cool form of writing right now, and this is people who are copying you, is lyrical anti-moralism. It's like people want, there are a lot of people writing baggy essays. They're like, I
feel responsible.
Yeah.
I read some bad stuff, and I'm like...
It's like, I rolled up to the party as the drugs kicked in.
Yeah.
Is that...
No, I know.
And I can't do that. I mean, I'm just not I'm not a first person, I don't I'm a less interesting person than you are. I'm really interested in ideas. I always have been. That's why I got interested in art writing in the first place. Is because I thought the art world was a place where there were interesting ideas going on. That this stuff was interesting philosophically, intellectually, culturally, and it was a place that people who were interested in ideas could have a conversation. The stuff that drove me crazy about the theoretical art writing is that it was bad theory because it pretended like real ideas are embodied. It pretended like these weren't objects that existed in spaces as part of social scenes. I think as a reaction to that, people have decided that we're going to write about the scene, which is good, feels really fresh, but to me it's like it doesn't matter if you show up at the party and everyone there is talking about nonsense. There has to be a party with smart people with ideas they're talking about. And if I actually do agree that I'm more optimistic about art writing intellectually. I'm very pessimistic about it commercially. Like, I think it's essentially dying. But like in terms of intellectually, I think that there's like actually a scene. There's like arguments and debates going on and new forms and new people doing new things. I think that's cool. But yeah, I'm not. I can't write. I can't do the hybrid party report.
I quit. I killed my column.
You don't have to do it, Ben. So
I'm interested in ideas too, but
no, I know you do. I think that's what makes. I think that's what makes. That's what I want to kind of bring out. Actually, is that I think that people are misreading the nature of this turn. That I think that it was about defining the present in relationship to like the emerging social structures and ideas people were talking about, not just like the cool kids are hanging out on rooftops again.
Yeah.
So scene, ideas, Reilly.
Briefly.
Oh.
I mean, I think ideas is a kind of good answer to what we were saying at the question at the beginning, which is like if criticism is a machine, what would it do? So one thing you can do is to like put ideas into words, and one of the reasons that's useful is that art is a form that is, for the most part, without words, and so it is useful to have people like bringing out those ideas and talking about them in depth, like putting down into words what is not into words. In fact, like a kind of common definition of what makes art so important is that art is kind of capable of expressing things that cannot be expressed in words. Like art can kind of communicate with us on different levels. You can't explain that exactly in words, but you can kind of bring out the ideas that are there in the work, or that are suggested to you but haven't been put into language.
So I want to open this up. We're going to continue talking, asking each other questions up here, but you all are part of this conversation. So if you have a question, just let us know. And I don't think we need a microphone out there. But before we do that, I want to talk to you, Reilly, because in your role as the director of Martos and Shoot the Lobster, you've got this really interesting hybrid position as both writer and gallerist. The fact that we're sitting here discussing art criticism within the very generously provided confines of an art advisory across the street from an art fair. We haven't really talked about money yet, and I don't know if that's because there's no longer really a connection there, but I think based on where we're sitting that there is.
Yeah, I mean, a conversation that's already sort of been started is the kind of fading role of the critic behind the collector base and how collectors are really sort of arbitrating what's being shown. And are becoming curators in and of themselves. And so I think the system's being like actively perverted, especially in the past, everybody's talking about the last 5 years is the most common phrase I'm hearing. And I feel like as a person that's also staging shows, to get a negative review, it doesn't feel good, but it also is exciting in terms of like, oh God, like what could I have done better? And also to sort of like accept, fallibility in doing the job, but also having done the job, I recognize how hard it is to just stage one exhibition. So it's hurtful, but also productive, and I don't necessarily feel combative, and I wouldn't argue against a criticism that's directed at me, but I do get excited about arguing against criticisms about other shows, for and against the criticisms. Yeah, and I think another problem too is that when you're staging an exhibition and you're working in a gallery, it's almost like there's a checklist that you're thinking about in terms of the show. It's like a review is just a check on the list, and a lot of times the gallerist isn't even reading the review. It's just like, okay, great, we got written up in X magazine, or people are paying for reviews and they're paying for sort of interviews, and that's a problem in and of itself, because there's you're talking about like objective sort of versus subjective writing, and yeah, and I think that the people don't have the time to read in the same way they used to, or they don't dedicate the time to read, and the critic has sort of become like these shadowy figures, or these names that again they're put on a list. Check it off. Okay, you want the New York Times. Everybody wants the New York Times review, but are you reading the review, or are you just taking a screenshot and posting it online? We got the review, great. Yeah, and so I think time is like a huge operative factor in like the value of writing, and in the value of the way that the gallery can sort of take in how it's being perceived outside of the immediate context.
So we are somehow so pressed for time and resources, but we still manage to lazily go through the motions of creating and publishing and disseminating art criticism. I love it. Questions from the audience as we go?
Hi. I just wanted to, my personal process in art writing is a lot more formalist. It's never really been about, do I like it, do I not like it? And I always approach it with a central question: what is the artist attempting to do? And do they succeed or do they fail, right? And if they succeed, even if I'm not 100% on board with whatever it is that they're doing professionally, that's something that I want to explain, and it puts it in a cultural context, and it explains the ideas that they're grappling with, right? And if they fail, well, then they fail, and I guess that's a negative review, right? And I find that this is the thing that the artists respond to the most vigorously, right? Like, I get that a lot. I mean, I've done most of my art criticism in Toronto. I'm just starting out here, but artists appreciate it when you look at what their intent is. Kiki Smith, yes, I'm trying to look at the intersection between the abject body and the feminine body. Thank you, right? Or Jenny Holzer, yes, I'm investigating the slogan. So I just wanted to sort of put that forth to you. Like, is that something that?
Why do you call that formalist? Because it's not. It's you're talking about extra formal properties.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
Intention is an extra formal category.
Right. Okay, so my terminology may be.
No, but I agree with the method, personally.
Right.
Intention
How would
is.
you respond to that as an approach? Because that's not something I haven't found really discussed at this point.
How do you guys respond to success or failure on the artist's part?
I recently read this book by Todd Cronin, and I can't stop talking about it, Against Effective Formalism. And in it, he sort of posits this idea of like the role of the art historian, and then to sort of the critic, and how the artist's work in the studio is limited to that context, and then once it emerges into the world, it kind of it leaves a lot behind. Like, it leaves the artist's intention, it leaves, etc. So I think there's like a twofold way to view an object. It's of course seeing like and what I write about a lot is what does the artist want, but or what does the artist want to communicate, and then the role of the critic being sort of did this come off successfully, but again, getting back to what Todd Cronin's talking about, it's like there is a potential disjuncture between the two, and I think like when the viewer meets the work, they're bringing a lot of like idiosyncrasies with them that are completely removed from the artist, and they're not, by and large, they're not talking to the artist. They're not getting in there, and they don't have the sort of like means with which to like really engage directly with the person making the work. So they have to come up with terms in and of themselves and in their, you know, personal like Rolodex of ideas and whatnot. And I think you kind of have to limit the amount that you're looking at exactly the artist's intentions and then just meet the object on its own terms.
I mean, I think it goes both ways, personally. I think, because I agree with that, but I also think that when the first quote about museums being an empathy machine, if to the extent that the empathy machine line is correct, it is exactly that. It is the process of art, the game you're playing is partly about like figuring out where the person who made this object was coming from, reconstructing that, and then determining whether they succeeded or failed on their own terms. People, I think, usually view that mode of criticism you're talking about as permissive, like people are playing a game whose rules they invented and therefore they always win. However, most people fail on the terms that they set out to play because they're playing with other people. So if you set out to make something beautiful, and then that can only be defined in relationship to someone receiving it. So I think it's a very useful method, but it's like one color in the palette that you might be painting with as an art writer, because I think the secondary contexts are important as well. And there are all kinds of things that are produced through creative misreading of things. I always love this anecdote about how open plan architecture in the United States just emerged when Frank Lloyd Wright saw the Japanese pavilion at the 1900 World's Fair and misinterpreted it because they had taken out the interior walls. He was like, "Oh, these Japanese architects are so inspiring." It's just a complete misinterpretation of their context. I think the the higher order thing you're doing is producing something interesting, because I think there's no method that can't be turned into a cliche, and yeah.
Other questions? Adam?
Yeah, I just wonder, I don't know, in my kind of observation, the demographic that is most demanding about reviews is particularly galleries, right? They're the ones who are kind of powering that economy, but it doesn't seem like they are actually stepping up and financing it in the way that they are demanding it in terms of buying advertising, supporting publications broadly that aren't one-to-one connected with, something that directly benefits them. That's, anecdotal on my end, but Ben and the rest, I wonder if you can shed a little bit of light on the economics of kind of the behind-the-scenes criticism and the why and why not things kind of materialize.
I do think it's sort of a conflict of interest in terms of buying space in a magazine with the hopes of having that magazine also publish a review. For me, it reads a little bit problematically. I think there are other avenues that I guess I don't have the imagination for, that I think should be funding art writing, not necessarily the galleries or the institutions that also want to be written about.
Like philanthropy.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, they do take out advertising that pays for the magazines, so it is a pretty direct correlation. It's actually, and if you look at fashion magazines, it's actually a lot worse. You're given clear quotas on how many full looks you have to shoot, how many covers this particular brand gets for taking out this much advertising. So art at least has a more informal system. I also think critics, I mean, we're here talking, we're getting paid by the art fair, not very much though, but it's I get a lot of, I think critics actually get a lot, at least for me, get a lot more money from the commercial sector than would have been the case before. This week, I've filmed a video for Hauser and Wirth. I presented a talk at Tara Downs Gallery downtown. People get hired for these Gagosian magazines, things like that. People get hired to do press releases. I think it's very entwined and compromised. And it's actually something I was thinking when we were talking about the short form review earlier. I feel like I feel like art critics really get hired to write press releases these days, and there's kind of, and actually like there's a growing appetite from artists to have like a writer they like write their press release, that previously that appetite might have been more like, oh, I hope I get a review in such and such a magazine.
I mean, the one thing I wanted to say about this is, I mean, I think the useful conversation about back of the book reviews and whether it's useful form is connected to, because I think people might want to. It might be useful to rethink the kinds of forms people think they ought to be patronizing, because I think what people think they want is a positive review, and I think actually that. Unconscious or conscious influence is responsible for the sense that people have that reviews don't have a lot of meaning. This kind of like smarmy quality that it's going to be a pick. It will tell you what to see. You know, that it is a good thing. This thing that is there and that other people say is good is also good, and that is. No meaning effect is produced when you read something about something other people said was good that someone else is also saying is good. If that's all it does, that does have a deadening effect. That's part of why there's this cult of the negative review, because like something appears meaningful when a difference is produced, like a disagreement or something is added to the discourse. And I think part of the usefulness of talking about, I don't know, the crisis of the back of the book review or something like that is because I do think that if you think of criticism, reviews are different than criticism, I would contend. If you think about criticism, historically, the high water marks of criticism, the things you think of are very rarely reviews, right? They're syntheses. Like if I think of John Berger, it's like one of my heroes, it's like Ways of Seeing I'm thinking about, which is a synthesis of a lot of things that he developed earlier. Or someone like Robert Hughes, it's like A Shock of the New, which is a synthesis of like things he wrote about modern art. So it's like when I see the kind of stuff that the attempts to patronize art criticism in new ways, I just think it's like if you reframe the problem of less of being about like picking things and telling you they're good, because I think that is a pretty moribund, lifeless thing, particularly people's sense, you know, that the hand of the market behind it. If you arrive at something that's like, the important thing is to introduce a new idea, you know, what new idea or synthesis or thing is being named here, that's something that I think there's a little more promise in terms of finding new ways to patronize. I think that's what people want anyways.
I think that also kind of requires, to some extent, the critic being willing to, you know, forego a seat at the table, an invite to the gallery dinner, because it's a lot less attractive for a gallery to invite a critic who's going out and giving negative reviews to their dinner. They sort of want the praise. They want the pretty talk, the sort of the positivity to sort of roll through. So I think a critic has to be brave.
So, as far as new models, 3 p.m., Julia Halpern, okay. Brian Joytcore, Alison McDonald from Gagosian Quarterly, Jessica Lynn, who I don't know is here. We've got 6 more minutes, which is time for maybe. But your hand was up a while ago. What's up?
Is that me?
That's you. That's you.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I was late. I just caught the end. But I'm interested in thinking about the run-up to the 2024 election. So we're now in a let's just talk about it. The post-Black Lives Matter art world. We're not doing the things that we were doing a couple of years ago. And I'm thinking about the specter of Trump and what the role of art criticism might be for culture in America.
What is it? Revolt?
The role of art
What role?
criticism in the context of culture in America.
Is it revolt?
No, I did misheard the word. I just misheard the word.
I don't think it will get talked about anywhere near as much as the last election cycle. We'll see. But yeah, I feel like we're in a very different moment now. I don't know what you think. I feel like I don't think we'll see like this kind of grand unified museums, galleries, writers, all kind of politicizing the text a lot, and kind of trying to make.
It worked so well last time.
Trump.
It's a very big question. It's like a top panel in and of itself.
I just don't necessarily, I mean, I don't think art is a catalyst for change, generally speaking. So it's hard to frame, I don't know, criticism as being, I don't know. It's such a big question, but yeah.
We'll do it again next time, and that will be the question that will be on the screen.
I mean, it's
a very basic question. How much of the, how much, like New York Times, all these that still publish criticism, how much of the writers are actually on staff, or is it all three?
Oh, none, almost none. The New York Times, I think it's 3. I mean, of critics. I mean, of art writers, there might be more. Of our cultural journalists, there might be more.
Somebody does need to fund some sort of study of every cultural masthead over the past 20 years to see where everybody went, if they're still in the art world, if they're happy with their choices.
Very, 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 very few. At this point, staff writing is almost like I was on a call with museum outreach professionals talking about they wanted to know how you get your show in Cleveland, Ohio, written about, by publications. There were journalists from the New York Times on this call, and who were like kind of offering, people were just like, what do we do, and at the end of it, I asked them, like how much, like when you do a preview for your for any of your shows. And there are people from museums all across the United States. How much of like your outreach is to writers, and how much is it to influencers? And they were like, it's 90 to 95% influencers at this point. I think the post-art criticism world is already here in most of the country. Like outside of New York, there is no, except for people who are passionate about it on a social level. There's just no, it's not, the way things get talked about is not through the medium of writing and publications. It's through posts and online discourse, and it's either deprofessionalized or sponsored by travel companies. Through.
Welcome to the unevenly distributed future of art writing. You had a question?
Yes, I have a question. So we're always talking about the reader. The specter of the reader is invoked in, conversations between editors and writers. It's the specter of the reader is present in, an MFA workshop and so on and so forth. But I feel that we don't do enough to interrogate who the fuck this reader is. And Ben, you opened a thread that I feel you didn't quite close earlier about, that argument against anti-intellectualism. And I want to kind of like hold that in the same moment as this question about the specter of the reader, because when we're thinking about the reader, like let's be honest, like most of us are thinking about a very particular, we're thinking about
This room.
no. And I, as an editor, I've used the reader as like telling a writer like, oh, the reader's not going to get this, and it's been used against me too. I've sanitized people with it, and it's been used against me to sanitize me. And so I just wanted to like bring our attention to this idea of the reader that we constantly invoke, and whose literacy we don't really like think about. Where does it come from? Who are they? Why are we like thinking about who is this reader that we're thinking about, and why are we constantly like centering this reader in such an abstract and I think sometimes risking on meaningless way, to be frank.
I mean, I try not to center the reader, for sure. Like, I think it's...
Dean hates the reader.
Yeah, I think it's better. It's hard to free yourself, actually, from thinking about reception, but I think really you want to, like, say what you think and try not to think about the reader or how it's going to be received at all. I think similarly with art, I think artists just shouldn't think about the audience or should try to free themselves from thinking about the audience as much as possible. When we had modernist avant-gardes, this kind of artists, maybe they were in a conversation with a small group of people like them, but they were not trying to be popular. They were not trying to make stuff for everyone. Now there's a real culture in art of like really centering the audience, and of course, like with discourse being like based on central media, like everything is kind of, you're just constantly you're constantly hearing from the audience whether you like it or not, like having your ideas graded, upvoted, critiqued. But the more you can free yourself, the better. I think it's a big problem with like millennials, actually. Like we care way too much about the opinions of other people, and we shouldn't. If you're a critic, like you should really, maybe shouldn't care at all.
Really?
Yeah, no, I agree. I too think like when I said I write for my mom and for the artist, that's generally like after the fact, like in the process of writing. It's almost like myself is the other person in the room that I'm writing to, or a sort of a omniscient other. It's like a shadow figure that has no sort of basis in any sort of like personality type or character. It's just like this thing, like amorphous thing that's being considered, or like. But a lot of the time, it's like really like me against myself, or me for myself.
See, I disagree. I don't think. I think the audience is really important, or having a sense of an audience, and I don't write as myself. Like there are opinions I have that I think that would require the writing to be a different kind of writing. If I was gonna have that particular argument, it's like you're crafting a specific object that is not you, is engaging with is generous in a certain way towards its object and towards its reader. I think that there is I guess I was thinking on the way here that there is a middle way between writing for yourself and writing for everyone, because I feel like that's what you're talking about. Maybe is how the specter of the reader as like the dumbest possible reader, it creates a kind of a super ego where you like, okay, you got to take out this political stuff, or you got to take out this stuff is too weird. This stuff is too weird. This stuff is too is going to offend the people, and I think that that's true. I think, and this is, there are real constraints on this when you're actually working within an institution or within social media. I agree with Dean that it's even worse. But I think that one way, writing for the audience that you want to have, like as an aspiration, is good. Like that's how I think about it. It's like I don't know if the audience that I'm thinking about exists, but I know what I would like the audience to be like, which is I like them to be like smart, engaged with the world, and committed to art as a material practice, interested in willing to funny people who enjoy a joke, but also people who care about the world. And I feel like that's constructing a world that doesn't necessarily exist. Like there's an ideal kind of person that
it's an ideal room. Thank you all for coming. Okay. We've got to wrap up. Thank you, Dean, Reilly, Ben. Everyone come back in 1 hour to see Julia Halperin discuss new models. And we didn't ask art criticism why, so next time.